Well, hello and welcome to Wheel Life, the video diary that helps you to understand what life is like living with an electric unicycle. And in this episode, I'm going to take a sideways swipe at the issues of legislation and the law relating to the use of EUCs here in the UK. And the law here is similar to many other countries around the world. Now, this is a subject I've looked at briefly in the past and covered on other episodes, but it's time that I rolled up my sleeves, pulled out the law books and looked at what the legislation really is for riders here in the UK. Let's get started. Now, the big question everyone wants answered is, are they legal? If I buy one and ride one, are the police going to snatch it away from under my feet, and will I end up with a conviction and a criminal record? Well, let's take a look at the headlines. Well, it finally looks as though legislation for PEVs is about to change here in the UK, and about time too. But let's not get too carried away or excited just yet. Now, earlier this year, the government indicated their intentions to bring into place some new legislation to address the rise of popularity and use of electric scooters. And as part of the Queen's speech, they said they were looking at a new transport bill that would recognise the use of light electric powered vehicles, which might include the use of electric unicycles. Now, later in this episode, I'm going to look at what that legislation might include, what we should expect, and how, where and when we'll be able to ride our EUCs. But until then, the law remains as it is, and given the shake-up in the government departments during recent months, and with the departure of Grant Shapps as the Minister for Transport for the last 3 years, who knows what this might mean. So let's take a look at the law in the UK as it stands right now. Now, at first glance, the rules are quite straightforward. So here is the message from the UK. The Crown Prosecution Service state that it is an offence to ride a powered transporter on a public road, in a pedestrianised area or places that are being set aside for the use of cyclists and horse riders. So that includes pavements and cycle lanes. So if you're riding at EUC in any of those areas, you are in breach of the law, you're committing an offence, and you are liable for prosecution. But here's the real kicker. It's time for a quiz. It's quiz time on Wheel Life, and the question this week is: the legislation used to set the laws that are applied to electric scooters and electric unicycles were written in which year? Was it 1835, the year in which the Texas Declaration of Independence was signed and Charles Darwin arrives at the Galapagos Islands? Was it 1945, the year that marks the end of the Second World War and Arthur C. Clarke puts forward the idea of geosynchronous communication satellites? Or 1985, the year in which Sir Clive Sinclair launched the C5 electrically assisted pedal cycle, the first mobile phone calls were made in the UK, and in which the Live Aid concerts took place? Yes, that's right. The legislation that means we can't legally ride our EUCs dates back to 1835. So let's just try and put that into a little bit of context. So that legislation was written in 1835 to limit the use of motorised vehicles. But the first cars weren't being built until 1885, 50 years later. So the legislation was written for the use of steam-powered vehicles. I think it's perfectly reasonable that you wouldn't want steam-powered engines trundling up and down pavements. Now, I believe that even the best lawyer in the land would struggle to argue that that legislation written almost 200 years ago should have any relevance on the use of PEVs in a modern and evolving society. However, if you look under section 72 of the Highway Act 1835, it states that it is an offence to ride on or to lead or draw a carriage on a pavement. Now, this rule applies to almost all vehicles, with the exception of mobility scooters and wheelchairs. So if we can't ride them on the pavements, what about on the roads? Well, for motor vehicles to be able to use public spaces and roads legally, they need to meet a few minimum requirements. Now, these include insurance, conformity with technical standards and standard of use, payment of vehicle tax, licensing, registration and driver testing. Now, the majority of riders that I speak to, they say they'd be willing to pay for a bit of insurance, even some licensing, if it meant they could use their EUC without the fear of some bobby with an attitude just waiting to take it from them and back to the station for a controlled explosion. Now, if we were able to meet those requirements, in principle it would be possible for us to use our EUC in public places. But we fall at the very first hurdle: insurance. Now, it was possible to get public liability insurance for riding at EUC, but if you were to have had a crash or caused some damage or harm to someone, then the insurance company wouldn't pay it out because you were doing something that was illegal. Now, if these were allowed to be recognised as vehicles, we could have them lawfully insured. But they're not recognised as vehicles, and so we can't insure them. And I have heard of a number of people having their case taken to court, and the final conviction was one of riding without insurance. Nothing else, just riding without insurance. But we would insure them if they were recognised as vehicles. You're telling us off for doing something that we don't want to do. We want to ride legally. We don't want to be a nuisance. But you won't let us insure them. So let us insure them. Why won't you let us insure them? Recognise these vehicles as vehicles and give them the space and time on the road. I mean, it's so frustrating. Why don't you allow us to do something that we all want to do safely and with insurance? Come on, please. So then, we've actually established that you can't lawfully ride them on the roads, on the pavements, or even on the cycle paths. So what about in other places? Well, sadly, the same restrictions apply because we're using areas that are accessible to members of the public, places like car parks or recreation parks or public parks like this one. So where's the good news? Well, the good news is that there are no restrictions or limitations on the use of powered transportation on private land with the landowner's permission, and so long as there's no accessibility to other members of the public. So that's great. If you live on the 13th floor in a small flat and your landlord says it's okay, then you can ride around to your heart's content. It's all a bit depressing, really. Time then to go now and look back at the proposed changes to legislation that are hopefully coming soon and see if that brightens our mood a bit. So back in May of this year, the government announced their intentions to look at changing legislation and introducing an entirely new category of vehicle. And we have to praise and thank the rise of popularity of the electric scooter for that. The government can no longer simply put their fingers in their ears and pretend that the evolution of public transport isn't happening. Now, we don't know what the legislation is going to look like, but the government have said that safety is going to be their paramount driving concern. So we can expect perhaps that the legislation will follow the same kind of rules that were put in place for the rental companies of these. And therefore we can expect that perhaps it's going to include some of the following. It might include speed restrictions, perhaps limiting speeds to something like 15 miles an hour. It may be that there's a minimum wheel size, again not relevant perhaps for EUCs, but some micro scooters with tiny wheels, that could be important. It might require the vehicles to have an effective braking system, again very important for scooters, not relevant for EUCs. Lights, yes, we can see the importance of that, and maybe even indicators too. Hand signals should suffice. It might require the vehicle to have some kind of a horn or a bell or to emit a noise. And there may be a requirement or a plea that riders wear a helmet and perhaps some other high-vis clothing or equipment. Now, it's not clear if EUCs are going to be included in this new type of categorisation of vehicle, but simply the fact of making this new category does open the way for such things to be considered. And all the guidance and legislation I've read so far, or information on the topic, does kind of include all types of new forms of innovative PEVs. So we are optimistic, but we do owe it all to the rising popularity of the scooter. So the next time you see somebody riding a scooter, no matter what you think about people who ride scooters, The rise of popularity of the scooter is the reason why legislation is changing, so we've got them to thank for it. So the next time you see one, give them a smile, say thank you, give them a cheer, a wave, and then ride past them at twice their speed. But in the meantime, does that mean we have to stop riding? So if we take the attitude that we shouldn't ride, well, then legislation is never going to change. Now, I firmly believe that PEVs and EUCs have got an important part to play in the revolution of public transportation. They're affordable, they're economic, they are good for the environment, and they're a lot of fun. Now, I've ridden for thousands and thousands of miles in the UK, and I've had lots of conversations and contact with the police. And in all of that, it's been very positive. Only on one occasion, when I was riding around close to the House of Parliament, was I asked to stop and get off, and I did, and it was fine. So what's my advice? Well, my advice is keep riding, but ride carefully, ride sensibly and respectfully. Don't be a nuisance and don't be a danger to others around you. And that way, if you do encounter a police officer who is a stickler for the letter of the law, well, perhaps he's more likely to just to smile and wave you by rather than to throw you into the back of his car with your hands firmly tied behind your back. Okay, well, that is it for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it entertaining and informative. And if you have, please do give me a thumbs up. It helps the channel a lot. And if you're one of those few people that's not yet subscribed already, well, I can only imagine you must be one of those children who was described as a late developer. But don't worry, it's not too late. You can still subscribe, hit that button now, and don't forget to toggle the bell to get notifications for all my future episodes. In fact, you won't want to miss the next one, which is all about how to win any argument with anyone who thinks you shouldn't be riding an EUC. Until next time though, please add your comments below. Ride safe, stay safe, and I'll see you again next time on Wheel Life.